Welcome back to Citizen One, exploring our urban future. I'm your host, Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and today I want to introduce you to Derek Lumpkins. His work spans diversity, equity, and inclusion, executive coaching, and business consulting through his firm, Refresh Strategies. And he is the host of the Redlining Forum and the Things They Don't Teach Us podcasts. Derek has lived in 3 countries and spends a good deal of time here in Spain. We try to grab coffee every so often and talk about stuff. Storytelling, writing, history, and DEI, a topic close to his heart. I invited Derek on Citizen One in this moment where diversity and inclusion work is not drifting. Far from it, but it is being actively challenged. Across the United States, DEI offices are being dismantled in public universities, training programs restricted by state law, and corporate initiatives scaled back under political and legal pressure. Globally, similar retrenchments are underway, reframed, renamed, or quietly absorbed into structures designed to reduce exposure rather than expand agency. Derek is a practitioner who has spent much of his career working where inclusion either survives contact with power or collapses. Cities, institutions, capital systems, and cultural infrastructure. He understands DEI not as language, but as civic machinery, something that determines who gets access, who gets displaced, and who is expected to absorb risk when systems tighten. Today, we want to move away from slogans and toward structure, ownership, housing, access to capital, and the everyday mechanics of belonging. Not to ask whether inclusion still matters, because it does, but to examine what happens when it's treated as optional at the very moment cities and entire industries are under the most strain. Cities, I'll tell you, are terrible liars. They can't really hide what we record and demonstrate to each other, or what we value in concrete, policy, and practice. This episode takes a look at what we can all see if we are willing to take a closer look at ourselves. Welcome, Derek. It's rainy this week, but I hope you've got your coffee ready.
I have my tea ready. It's sitting right here by my side.
All right.
Good to be here today.
Thanks for joining. I'm really excited about this conversation, and I think we brought up some interesting areas to explore, and we're going to keep this kind of free form. But first, if you don't mind, just kind of introduce yourself. Give me a little of your background.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Boston, Mass, and went to high school there. Afterwards, I went to college just in a small town just outside of Philadelphia. And that was my first, I would say that was my first exposure to people of significant wealth. And granted, they were students just like I was, but just the things they referenced, the cars, they actually had cars that they drove, just really kind of stood out as something like I had never really seen before by people who were my peers. Even though they dressed, this was the 90s. This was the 90s. They dressed in a way that I was sort of like, why don't you have like nice clothes? The cars, the things they referenced, the trips they would go on, I was sort of like, wow, they come from a lot of money. And it's the first time I'd spent a significant amount of time around people with that level of wealth. It was also the first time I would say I'd spent time around people from other countries, a significant amount of time. So I had flatmates, roommates, classmates from Africa, from Asia, from Europe. And so just seeing the diversity that they brought to the campus was eye-opening in its own way. So from there, I lived in Japan for 5 years, primarily teaching English. I then decided I wasn't ready to go back to North America, so I did my master's degree in London. So I spent 1.5 years there. The half was because I was trying to find work to keep me there. I couldn't. Went back to the US, and then I lived there for about 20 years. Is that right? Yeah, about 20 years, 21 years, which is where I began my, I suppose you could say, my adult career. So that's where I started getting into more of the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, in part because that was just what I had been sort of used to in terms of what I've been living previously in Japan and in London. But moving back to Boston, and specifically moving back to the neighborhood where I was from. So I'm from the neighborhood of Roxbury in Boston, which for the past 150 years or so has been primarily a Black neighborhood in the city of Boston, or it became a Black neighborhood in the city of Boston. And when I would start meeting people around Boston who were in different fields because I was, again, starting my adult career. So I would meet them in different events, in different galas, in different networking things. They would say, "Oh, where do you live? What do you do?" And I'd say, "Oh, I live in Roxbury." And they would look at me and say, "Oh." And it was this look of like sometimes disappointment, sometimes surprise that I was in this crowd with them, sometimes a little bit of, "Oh, we feel bad for you." And I specifically remember this one woman. I must have met her in 2009 or so, where it's this older woman. She had to be in her 60s or 70s, and I was in my 30s, early 30s by that point. And I said, "Oh, I live in Roxbury." And she just asked me this question. It was like, "Well, have you been anywhere?" And again, I just told you that I lived in Japan and in the UK. And when I was in both of those countries, I traveled extensively around the region. So I traveled all around East and Southeast Asia, and I traveled around Europe and into Morocco. I had been a few places. And so, it was just kind of just this assumption and just this idea that because I'm from a place, I must not have ever left that place. To me, just kind of struck me as like, people still think that way. And it wasn't just her. There were other people also, again, as I was beginning to move up the ranks of this organization I was working at and began to go into more and more events and meet more and more people, the ways in which they would approach me once they knew that I was from Roxbury, the way in which they would talk to me when they knew I was from Roxbury, not just because it's a Black neighborhood, but also because it's a lower class neighborhood economically. There was just these assumptions that they would try to put on me to sort of, I would say, keep me in my place. And even the last few years that I spent living in Boston full time, because as you referenced, I do live in other countries. I've traveled around a little bit more. But the last couple of years, I had a boss who was, again, from the suburbs of Boston. And the ways in which she would approach me were kind of like, "I'm going to keep you in your place." Even though I was hired to be the number two in the office, and I was hired ostensibly to provide her with genuine feedback and with a different perspective on things, the fact that I didn't agree with her on a lot of things left her wanting to put me in my place, to be very candid. But whenever she was asked the question, this is a white woman from the suburbs, she would say, "I'm feeling defensive. I'm feeling attacked. I don't want to answer these questions." And we were literally asking her, "Have you heard an update yet?" So, just maybe I'm straying a little bit too far from the topic, but just these kind of interactions I've had over the years, professionally, personally, socially, have kind of shaped my thinking and shaped my approaches to DEI and also just to casual encounters.
So, just a little more into your background. Tell me a little bit more about your work in Boston. And you've worked with the city of Boston, I guess, in a consulting role. But tell me some of the neighborhood type of challenges that you've addressed through your DEI consulting work.
Sure. So I worked for an organization called Discover Roxbury, and it was founded, I would say, in the late 90s, and it existed until a few years after I left. And it was designed to be a mechanism to support the arts, culture, and history of the neighborhood through tours and other guided experiences around the neighborhood. And so during that time, I started off as being the program manager, then I became the marketing and program manager, then I became the executive director. And what I did during that time was to sort of shift the narrative that we were projecting as an organization, which then helped shift the narrative that was being discussed about Roxbury. So part of that shift was saying that we're not just this neighborhood that's here to be a recipient of goodwill or to be a recipient of charity or to be a recipient of things. We also have history. We also have culture. We also have ideas that can benefit the rest of the city and benefit the country as well. Being a neighborhood that has existed as long as it has, so the neighborhood was founded in 1631, we outdate the founding of the United States. And so we have so much history that can be shared, but people would say, "Oh, that's the alternate history." I'm like, "Well, how is the alternate history? It existed. It's just not the one that was promoted as the mainstream." And so I spent a lot of my time in the early years just saying, we're not the alternate. We're part of the mainstream of what shaped the city and also shaped parts of the United States history and culture. And so during that time, as the program and marketing manager and then as the executive director, I did do some work with the city of Boston, So I served on the Boston Cultural Council. It was a committee of people from across the city who would give feedback on certain things the city was doing. But we also reviewed grants and we helped decide where some of the grant funding would go to organizations who applied. When Mayor Walsh won his race, I worked on the transition team. So I helped provide some ideas for the transition and culture. And also when Governor Deval Patrick also won, I think, his second term, I was nominated by someone. I'm still not sure who, but I was nominated and then served on his arts and culture committee as well.
Very cool. So a lot of what I'm hearing from you, there's definitely and I'm writing more and more about this in some stuff I'm working on about southern U.S. cities in the fiction realm. But there's recorded history, and then there's unrecorded history. And what I'm hearing from you in the context of Roxbury since 1661, there's both urban history, but there's also cultural history. There's Black history. There's immigrant history, obviously, of many different people. And so what I'm hearing that you're well suited is in recentering the narrative toward more voices. And you and I have talked before about structural inclusion. Do you feel like for cities and neighborhoods, that's one of the biggest challenges is structural inclusion?
Question. I think it's part of it. So you mentioned narratives and you mentioned structural inclusion. So I think narrative kind of happens in two ways, at least in my experience. So narrative is expanding the narrative. So part of what I was doing with Discover Roxbury was trying to expand the narrative by saying Boston isn't just these colonial stepping stones, which then jump to the present day. It's all the other pieces that go in between that connect us broadly. But in the work that I did at a university in Boston after that, so I went from working at a small nonprofit organization to working at a very large educational nonprofit organization. It was about recentering because the neighborhoods around that university would say the university is colonizing us. And so in the work that I was doing at the university, it was meant to provide the resources of the university to the neighborhoods around it. But in doing so, I said, this is not going to work if we just open our doors and say, hey, come on in. We need to center the narratives around the neighborhoods and show that we're supporting them, not that we're just letting them come in as some form of charity. And so in that sense, we did reframe things around that. Yeah. So in terms of structural inclusion, I do think cities and neighborhoods do have a very long way to go, particularly in the United States. Neighborhoods aren't just neighborhoods, they're also encoded by race and they're also encoded by class.
Yes.
And particularly in the older East Coast cities, even though they've gone through hundreds of years and generations of people coming in and people moving out and neighborhoods and communities changing, a lot of that kind of got fixed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s when we built the highways. So when we built the highways, we changed this habit as a society of just having these boundaries, these mental boundaries, and we made them physical. So by doing that, we now said, okay, this isn't just the Puerto Rican neighborhood, or this isn't just the Asian neighborhood because we remember that it is. It is now this because we have physically delineated that it will be. And by doing so, we cut people off from different levels of access, different points of access, whether it's by transit or by where businesses would set up, where people were allowed to cross. So we started actually building walls around neighborhoods and just said, this is just a highway. It's just a road. It's just a road. Don't worry about it. But it actually became walls as well. So yeah, the structural impediments are there as well.
Yeah. I remember this from some previous history I wrote about Knoxville, Tennessee, and I did some research into the naming of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. boulevards in southern cities, and how often the designation was not the result of the Black community's input and public process as much as it was white leadership demarking an area saying, let's not invest here. We can at least contain and segregate here. And I know that's maybe a controversial statement to make, but I think it's really important because it wasn't just the interstate highway system. It was also labeling. Black business districts were often called the Bowery or, and were pushed to the margins or razed entirely during urban renewal, taking away the black churches and the business owners to build, in Knoxville in particular, it was the Civic Coliseum and the public safety building. The jail was on a former vibrant black neighborhood. And I think that's when I talk about structural inclusion, that's kind of exactly what I'm getting at is where did we put the concrete? Because I think that's much more systemic and I think we'll get into the other interesting area is where like you said about your work with the university, coming in, offering support, offering help, but genuinely listening to the case studies and the problems at hand in the neighborhoods is so much more important than what we see in what I call performative DEI. Let's tell ourselves we're doing a good job. We're going to pat ourselves on the back and tell people we care. I can't tell you how many public meetings I've gone to where the outcome was already a foregone conclusion by the developers. But at least they could check the box and said they had public participation workshops. We listen, we care. So where does your instinct as a storyteller, and I know you veered away from recentering, and I think what I heard you say is more listening, which is not something cities and city leaders are very strong at sometimes. But what has that instinct helped you in terms of really getting to the crux of saying what tends to be avoided? How do we get to truth?
Getting to truth requires coming to terms with history.
Yeah.
So I believe that history is like we have our histories, we have our individual histories, we have our familial histories, we have our neighborhood and social histories, but we tend to forget that those histories have histories as well. So you and I were just talking about the highways and how they displaced communities and how concrete was poured over neighborhoods. But that didn't just happen in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. That happened in the 1910s and 20s as well. I mean, Greenwood, Oklahoma, that district in Tulsa, wasn't just, highways didn't just get built over nothing. I mean, we know that just over 100 years ago, there was a Tulsa massacre. You and I talked about Red Summer, which happened across the U.S. You probably know as a writer that Zora Neale Hurston went to Florida and she documented Black communities in that state, including some that eventually got razed to the ground. So this is something that has happened throughout the course of the 20th century. And we know, of course, it happened after Reconstruction. So in the 1860s and 70s, we know it happened before the Civil War. All those years, leading up to, from the Revolutionary War up until, the Civil War, we know what happened during all those times. So this is not new. And then, of course, we know that the Native Americans also had their problems, and they still do have their problems with some of these patterns as well. So all the stuff that we talk about now has a history. So if we're going to get to the truth, we have to be able to speak openly and honestly about the truth and the history that's behind it. Because otherwise, if we say, oh, this just happened at this one time, and we don't recognize that it's a pattern, and we just say, oh, it's just a one-time event, it'll all just pass, or it's already passed. We're not reconciling. We're not coming to a reckoning with what has actually gotten us here. We're just saying, oh, that's just the starting point. And it's like, no, we've been here so many other times before, and we've never reckoned with it. So we need to recognize that it exists. And once we recognize that it exists and it's a pattern, we can then interrogate the causes. We can interrogate some of the variables that sort of push things forward or push things into a certain way and begin to disrupt the patterns. And that's kind of the exciting part of what I find about doing some of the work I've done in DEI is like, we start seeing the patterns. Like we ask people, okay, what do you see as the problem now? And then as we begin to interrogate, we say, okay, this problem isn't just for you, Bob. It's also with Susie. It's also with John. It's also with Joe. It's also with Kate. There's a pattern that we can see amongst all of you here, but then those of you who have been here for a longer amount of time. So if you've been at this company, if you've been with this organization for 5 years or 10 years, you've seen this happen before and you begin to reveal that. And so it's revealed as not just being something that exists at this level, but it also exists at this level, a deeper level as well, so that people can see this has legs, this has longer legs, and it has outlived me, or it's outlived my time here. And in order for us to improve what we're trying to improve, we need to disrupt the pattern. and disrupt the cycle so that we can begin to move forward in a new way. Or we can at least choose to move forward in a new way.
What are some concrete tools to disrupt these patterns?
So in some of the work that I've done with organizations and with companies, the folks who want to have us come in, so usually work with a partner, and the folks who have us come in say, this is what we see as a problem, and can you help us get past it? And so we start asking these questions like, well, why do you see this as a problem? We just simply just asking questions sometimes. Why do you see this as the problem? And they're like, well, this happened and that happened, and it's causing tension. But tension just doesn't appear out of nowhere. Just like tension in your body doesn't just happen. You have to have done something. You have to have strained yourself. You have to have had some type of movement or activity to have caused that tension. And the same thing with a body of people. And so we're like, well, we would like to do a survey and just ask them. Just ask, some very simple questions, usually not more than 10. It's an anonymized survey so that even we can't know who's answering what. And by doing that survey, we just collect data. And it's data that a lot of times, even people who have been there for a long time just have never even thought about. They've never uncovered it. They've never even tried to explore it. Even if they have thought about it, they've never tried to explore it because they don't have the distance from it in order to do so in a way that provides them with a little bit of impartiality. So asking questions, doing a survey, and then important in this work, whether it's at a university, like as a staff person at a university or someone who's running a DEI workshop or training, is to provide that information back to the participants, provide it back to the people who are giving it. Because just to say, we're going to collect this information and then we're going to organize a workshop, or we're going to put together a program and then we'll just run with it. People don't understand, like, well, how did you come up with that? Why is this the way we're moving forward? Like, are you sure you got my information? So providing that information back to them and saying, we've synthesized it. It's still anonymous. It's still synthesized, but this is the pattern that we're seeing. This is the pattern that we believe exists. Do you also see this based on what we're presenting back to you? Giving that level of going from just an interrogation to a conversation with the people who are involved really begins to break down some of the defenses and allows people to open up and say, okay, I feel like I'm being heard. I feel like I'm being seen. I feel like there's a genuine group that exists here that will actually want to address this. I'm going to participate. It may be a little bit cautious. It may be a little bit tentative, but the fact that people are participating and they're getting past some of their defenses is a way in which we use some of these tools in order to advance some of the ideas and advance some of the metrics that we're trying to move forward.
It sounds to me like, and I've participated in a lot of these kind of workshops. I remember it was International Women's Day when I was working in London at a corporate office. And they said, we want to have some really frank conversations. We want to have some hard conversations. But it was led by a white guy. He was facilitating the entire dialogue. And you're just kind of like, maybe you're not the best person to be leading this workshop. I don't know. Call me crazy.
Was it a dialogue or a monologue? Because that also matters too.
It was a monologue followed by some breakout groups, and they wanted uncomfortable questions. So we tried to help them out. But I think that reminded me of that story, because you can have an opinion. You can say there's a lack of representation here, but that's just an opinion. But when you do these workshops the right way, you can create just a little bit of agency to where somebody finally no longer just has an opinion, but can, dare I say, become a stakeholder.
Right. Absolutely.
Is that the goal?
Well, everybody is a stakeholder. Everybody is automatically. Whether you're a participant in a company or you're a staff person at a university or a student at a university. I've had students. I was once thrown. I'll tell this anecdote. I was once thrown into this panel. So my boss was supposed to be on the panel. This was a student group. I forget what exactly it was, but they wanted to interrogate how the university was being a good neighbor to the communities around it. And so my boss was, the head of one of the diversity arms of the university. But he suddenly had a conflict. He agreed to do it, but he had a conflict. And I was like, of course you had a conflict. And he probably did, but he also was just kind of this, he's a bit roguish. If you're in Boston, being roguish is not a bad thing, but he was a bit roguish sometimes. So he would just kind of like, just flit off and be like, oh, you can handle this. And I'm like, I'm not prepared to handle this. He's like, oh, no, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. And so I sat in this panel, and the students, I think, were a bit thrown because they were not as hostile as I think they would have been with my boss, which I'm very grateful to those students for. But they were asking these questions around how can the university do better? How can the university be a better neighbor? I was both a university employee, but also a resident of one of the neighborhoods they were talking about. I kind of span this duality. I had to like operate with this duality all the time. And so I said, well, taking off my university hat and just being a resident, you have to remember that residents don't see a difference between the institution and you. You are the institution. You are the university. So when you walk down the street with the university caps and university sweatshirts, or when you rent a house or rent an apartment and you're being super loud and the residents have to call the cops, that you do it again 2 weeks later, you are the university. So you can't separate yourself from that. And they were kind of taken aback by that. And then I said, well, also when you go off campus, whether you're going shopping, you go to your dorm, not your dorm, but you go to your apartment or whatever it is, you go off campus, maybe you're volunteering somewhere and you come back on campus and then you hear your friends or your classmates or your dorm mates disparaging a neighborhood, saying that it's not worthy, it's dirty, it's, dysfunctional, it's drug addicted, it's whatever. Do you correct them? Because if you don't correct them, you're just as bad. You're just allowing this to perpetuate. That really threw them. In a good way, though, because they were like, oh, yeah, I guess I need to go back. I remember this person. It got them talking amongst themselves instead of this being this one-way interrogation of like, what can you, university, do better? It's like, what can we as a university do better? And so I thought that was a powerful moment for them and, kind of nice to see from my part.
I like that. I live here in El Raval in Barcelona, and I've been in a mini TikTok battle with some local, estate agents, immobiliers, realtors, whatever you want to call them here. But they were literally throwing up the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods of Barcelona on TikTok with a big red X over my neighborhood. Don't live here. It's dangerous. This was last week. Okay. This isn't like back in the 90s. And you're right. Because even, as somebody lived here about 2.5 years, and I was shocked at the stigmatization that is being evidenced by a professional company and a professional in an industry. If you don't want to live here, don't live here. I love Raval, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. And I'm shocked at the number of people who just let that dialogue, or not really a dialogue, it's more of a monologue transpire instead of speaking up. And, I love my neighbors here in the building and we're close friends and it's not all pickpockets and mayhem over here, but there are neighborhood challenges. There is crime like anywhere else. I think statistically you can find heavier amounts of crime in some wealthier districts. That's just not as characterized that way. Representation matters. From your professional experience, from your experience as a student and a world traveler, I remember working in corporate communications years ago. We always had the diversity check boxes, which is really that early DEI of literally when we were taking photographs, did we have representation of all the right races and ethnicities, gender, et cetera? We're clearly, hopefully moving past representation optics from early DEI and that middle tier that we can explore. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on is where policy and language start to change. And then get into the current reality of where we are today, which I alluded to in the introduction. So talk to me about the shift from representation optics into actual policy and language transformation, if you don't mind.
It's interesting. I've had some very tentative thoughts about that recently, and I don't know that we're past it. So I think representation, of course, still matters. It still matters on a lot of levels. And it's very situational. So, being here in Spain or in London or in Japan, particularly when I was in Japan, representation mattered because where I would go, if people hadn't seen someone who looked like me before, well, London, not so much, but Spain and Japan, and mostly Japan, I'll focus on Japan. People would just be shocked. If I turned the corner, I would literally see people go, they would just like gasp and then stare. And at first, it really annoyed the hell out of me. It just really annoyed me. But then I was sort of like, in particular where I was, because I was in a very small rural town. Then I was like, let me do some math here. And so then I started thinking about who all the foreigners were within a certain radius. There were 10 Westerners because there were other people. There were Chinese, there were Koreans, but they didn't stand out as much as we did. And then I was the only Black person. So I felt like I had this dual responsibility to be a good representative of both, well, of Americans, of Westerners, and of Black people in general. And not to say that it was a heavy load, because it wasn't. I mean, I am who I am, so I can't change that. But it still felt kind of like the representation that I bring matters. So I would go out of my way to say, yes, of course I can use chopsticks. People would be surprised by that. They'd be like, you can use chopsticks? I'm like, of course I can. We have Chinese restaurants. We have Vietnamese restaurants in the United States. Of course I can. And so just, sort of breaking those initial barriers of ignorance, and not in a negative way, but just like they just didn't know, the representation matters. And that still exists everywhere you go to this current day. Where it doesn't matter what policy is, you can have, so just taking the Black community in general, you can have Black faces in high places. That doesn't mean it's going to translate into power. That doesn't mean it's going to translate into like real on the ground change. So, okay, first of all, I'll say I'm a rather progressive person. For those who are not progressive, sorry, but my examples would be Ben Carson and Cardi B these days. Trying to think of who else, but just thinking of those two right now. Condoleezza Rice, maybe, but she was in a whole different. Who?
Nicki Minaj.
Nicki Minaj. Is that who I'm thinking of instead of Cardi B?
Well, she's recently embraced MAGA in a very big
Right.
way.
It's either Nicki Minaj or it's Cardi B.
Yeah.
So there's one who sort of is embracing the MAGA far right, not even just the right, but the far right. Like if it was Colin Powell, I'd be like, okay, Colin Powell, you're doing your thing. He's sort of conservative, is sort of right. Ben Carson's a little bit further to the right, but this is going even further. And even Pharrell, where there is this attempt to blame and shame people who never had communities. I won't say people, but communities who never had the level of access, the level of resource, and level of respect to attain the access and the resource are being blamed for not having access and resource. It's like, well, wait. So you're not going to help people gain access or resource. You're not going to provide access or resource, at least to the children, so that they can at least grow to the point where they can use it and have the advantages that these other children have. You're just going to say, look at them, they deserve this. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in terms of a policy. It doesn't make sense in terms of the logic behind it. But then again, getting to the larger point, just having Black faces in high places doesn't matter if they're actually not committed to changing and challenging the system and making it work for more people.
I think that's a really key phrase, making it work for more people. And, the other one I thought about, of course, was Kanye West. And, you reach a certain level and then, you've got an opportunity, you've got a pulpit, and it's how you choose to use that, uh, regardless of your race or ethnicity. I think you reach a certain level. Do we, and I know it's a cliche to a certain extent, but it's handout versus hand up. And I think you want to broaden the opportunity to more people, whether it's kids in school in Roxbury or in Appalachia, where I grew up. And I'd go to meetings in Baltimore back in the .com era, and they asked if we actually wore shoes or not. So stigmatization happens cross-culturally, but it's what do you do when you reach an even modest degree of success? Do you bring people along with you, or do you shut the door? And I think that's where we're at this kind of crossroads. As I mentioned up in the intro, the current state of DEI is a little is a little tenuous right now in terms of the language and the resulting structure from what we're seeing in the public universities, what we're seeing with changes in state law, we're seeing at the federal level. I'm not getting into politics, but we are seeing the erasure of Black experience of representation at many levels, both across gender as well, what we can and cannot talk about in these places. And you said you consider yourself progressive. So what comes next? There's a lot of work to do in DEI unapologetically. There's nothing woke about it. Compassion, if I'm considered a compassionate person that cares about my neighbors, whether I'm in El Raval or Roxbury, that ain't a bad thing in my opinion. It doesn't make me soft. It doesn't make me less of a person, and it doesn't make my neighbors less of people. So I'm kind of soapboxing right here, but where do we go next? What does your work do in terms of what I'm, kind of referring to as sort of a structural reckoning? How do we keep this, pendulum swinging toward justice?
Well, I think in the American context, at the very least, one of the things we have to remember is the most powerful motivator is money. Let's start there. So one of the most powerful motivators is money. And it is assumed that because you're trying to bring in, I shouldn't say it's assumed, but this feeling, this belief that if you're trying to bring in people who are from lower economic classes, people who never have had resources, who have very limited resources, who don't have the same background as you, by providing them with these opportunities and this access to resources, someone else has to lose out. Someone else has to lose money, or that money is being lost in the effort to try to bring these people to a level or to a point that other people have already existed at for generations of time. So because DEI covers all of that, there's this kind of feeling that DEI loses money because it takes more time, it takes more effort to include everyone, to bring in ideas and to vet them and to do it in a way that makes sense for a broader base of people. So that's one thing we have to remember, is that money is involved. It's not just sort of like the moral equation is there. The human impact and the human value of things is there as well. But in the American context, it's dollars. Everyone has an economic value attached to them, partly through who they are, like how they look, and if they're tall or short, or man or woman, or white or black, whatever. Everyone has an economic value attached to them. But then what they do raises or lowers that value accordingly. So in some of the work that we've done, so my partner and I, one of the suggestions we've made is to say, well, when it comes to looking at promotions, or when it comes to looking at helping junior members of a group rise up to higher levels, some mentorship, basically. And we've suggested, have you considered making part of DEI or assisting other people part of your ways in which you can be promoted? So if you have someone who is a tenured faculty and they oversee some non-tenured faculty, or they oversee some teaching assistants, in order for them to get a pay bump, can you include something that shows that they have assisted other people at reaching another level, or that they've expanded their access out, or they expanded their influence outwardly, so that other people have access and they have opportunity, so that you're bringing new people into the fold, but you're also adding a value to that work. Because people right now are saying, so tenured faculty, for example, they are being paid more for their research, they're being paid more for their books, they're being paid more for certain things that actually produce dollars. Their research, whatever it is, they actually produce dollars. Someone will come and say, here, I'm giving you a grant, or here, I'm going to buy your book, so they get dollars. But they're not encouraged, per se, to help other people improve the field or to expand the field. So if you can add some type of economic incentive that way, that might be another way in which you can make diversity, equity, inclusion more valued to more people in a way that they're familiar with.
Right.
So that was one way in which we try to do it. But again, in a system that doesn't value individuals, and it also doesn't value communities, expanding access isn't valued. It just isn't valued. So I think what's happening now, where there is this discussion, mostly amongst people on the left, but some moderates, people in the middle as well, where they're saying the system is collapsing. And so we need to start envisioning what's next, I think is an important conversation. My concern is that not enough people are actually having the discussions around what the next thing looks like,
Mhm.
or as these cracks in some things are happening, how we take advantage of those. So just saying things are breaking, we're going to have this new society. And it's like, well, but we need to decide how that's going to actually come together. Because if we don't, things will break. We're all going to be in a bit of a mess. And then those who already have power and access and influence will just reconfigure things in a new way that's also not going to be a benefit to most people. And so I think the pandemic was a great example of that. So in the pandemic, we had this global shutdown. We all moved to working online. We all moved to doing different things online. Not all, because of course you had the first responders, you had the grocery shoppers, you had all those folks who kind of got screwed in the process. But the vast majority of people, at least in the Western world, moved to an online system. Here we are, 6 years later, and most people are going back to the 9 to 5 that was not parent friendly, that was not environmentally friendly, that sucks up a lot of people's time. It uses a lot of resources. And it was, to me, I see it as a squandered opportunity for us to have created something different that could have worked for more people better. But because those who own real estate, those giant buildings in downtowns, and the property taxes that went along with it, and all the government bonds that are based on that, I don't know the whole economics of it, but all that is so intertwined and entangled that for us as a society to sort of say, we're going to move to something new would have caused bigger problems or different problems that they didn't want to address. And so now
Yeah.
so many people are going back to that system that just does not work.
Well, and I think that's where there's a certain level of cultural fatigue. We don't know what to do next. So let's just stop talking about it for a while. We'll call it woke so we don't have to deal with it and the problem will just go away. But there are material consequences to that. And I think you can look at Target in particular as an example of forgetting who their customers were in their overreaction in terms of just ripping out DEI. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what could have, I think they lost like $700 million and now they've announced they're going to spend $5 billion to get people back in their stores is what I read on the news in the last couple of weeks. Now, wow, if I had $5 billion to spend, that would be really cool. But if you're redecorating the store, you're literally moving the chairs around on the deck of the Titanic instead of creating internal programs that would expand. My daughter worked for Target some years ago, could have moved her into management or gotten new education opportunities or better training or, there's so many things you could spend money on that shifts away from virtue signaling to actual core DEI values that ain't woke at all. They're actually very equitable, very inclusive, very diverse, very fair. And have we just lost our minds and think we got to redecorate now?
I don't know Target's ever coming back. I mean, sorry, Target. I used to enjoy shopping there, but I don't know it's ever coming back because so if you look at kind of the pool of companies, the pool of big companies that involve, so take Disney, Target, and Comcast. Let's take those
Yes.
three.
Great examples.
Comcast is a necessary thing because in some cases you can't get TV, you can't get internet, some places, some markets, you can't function in the 21st century without the kinds of services that Comcast provides. Or they're the only one that provides the content. So you may get your service from somewhere else, but Comcast provides a lot of the content. So in some ways, you just can't do without them. They're not quite a utility, but they're almost at that point. Then you have some place like Disney. Other than Universal Studios, what else is like Disney? Six Flags? Kinda, in terms of like the theme parks, but in terms of like the actual entertainment juggernaut, Disney is kind of a hard thing to beat. I mean, it owns terrestrial TV, it owns the streaming platforms, it has over a century, I think, of entertainment that generations of us have grown up upon. It exists as this cultural reference point for generations of us and across countries. Sometimes it surprises me when I go to places and people are like, oh yeah, I watched the Little Mermaid, or they're singing Encanto, or they're singing, I mean, like, okay, sometimes I'm really surprised by just how much Disney exists in the global context. So again, it's like Comcast, not quite a utility, but it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's kind of like church. It's everywhere. You may not go to the church, but things about it, the stories, all the songs, all the stuff, somehow you hear about them. They infect your life. So then you have a place like Target. Okay, it's a store. It's a store. So we have choice. We have choice as consumers. We can go to that store or not go to that store. Target sells groceries. So does Stop and Shop. Target sells underwear. So do a whole bunch of other places. Target doesn't sell a whole lot of things that we can't do without. So I don't think it's coming back. And I think stores like Target or businesses like Target will not come back to the way they used to be. I think they're going to die very slow, painful deaths because they don't exist at the scale of like a Walmart. But they're also not necessities either. And I think that's one of the powers. I think that's a power that we have as consumers and power that we have as society is to say, if they're not supporting us, we don't need to support them. And so I'm not going to speculate on how Target can come back because at this point, they've wasted too much time. And if Target's going to die, I have other choices. We all have other choices.
I used to work for Target many, many, many years ago, and they're long gone. And, store brands come and go. But at the end of the day, you're right. They're just store brands.
Right. And I read an article recently about Sears and how there's only 4 Sears left in the country, 2 of them in Florida, and how people go and they're sad to see Sears is dying off. And I'm like, yeah, I used to shop at Sears as well, but I forgot about them until I read that article.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about them in a decade or more. So Derek, we could talk about brands all afternoon, and I think Target and Comcast and Disney are great examples. And I think you and I even talked before about again the performative DEI and where companies are losing money, the battles Disney had in Florida with Governor DeSantis. And I've mentioned to you before how Pride Month has been so co-opted by corporate brands when Oxford Street in London, and you see all the Pride paraphernalia all month, and then they, no pun intended, tuck it away in the closet the rest of the year when they could be spending that money much more tangibly on programs that serve, LGBTQ youth, homelessness, a lot of challenges out there that could be better addressed. And that brings me back to how cities are largely, we could talk about companies and industries and brands, but cities are in fact a real DEI battleground, are they not? Let's talk about how urbanism is where inclusion either, succeeds or fails. What are your thoughts there on cities and inclusion and what the key intersection points are?
It's interesting because you said that cities are battlegrounds. As someone who grew up in a city, someone who loves being in cities and still lives in a city, I don't think cities are the battlegrounds, but I think people make cities the boogeymans so that they become these battlegrounds. The battles are not happening in cities. They're not happening in the way in which politicians describe them. These right-wing politicians in the US and in other countries are saying, people are getting mugged, they're getting raped, all these crimes are happening. It's not true. It's just not true. So, the literal and figurative battlegrounds of cities, it's just not happening. It's happening in people's imaginations. And so I think cities, particularly these massive cities that are like 5, 10 million people, 20 million people, are wildly successful. They're wildly successful. Some of these cities are the sizes of countries. They have economies greater than countries. And so they're wildly successful at bringing in people from a diversity of places, diversity of backgrounds from all corners of the world. And so they're wildly successful at doing that and incorporating them into their economies, which is not to say that there is not hierarchy. And it's not to say that there isn't poverty, grinding poverty in some places. But people are still moving to cities, and the world is projected to be, I think, 80% of humanity, I think, is projected to be in cities in the next 20 years, maybe more than that. So, cities are successful, and they could be made more successful if people weren't trying to, I still don't even really know what some of these anti-urban, anti-city politicians are really going for. Because I don't see what the benefit is by saying that a city doesn't work, by saying X, let's say New York City, by saying New York City or Chicago just don't work and we need to dismantle some aspect of them. I don't understand the point. I don't understand what they're trying to do there other than just try to take control. And other than just try to be this person who says, I think it should be this way, versus by listening or by observing the 3, 10, 20 million people who live there and who work there and seeing how they can make their lives better. I don't see the point in saying that cities should be dismantled or cities should be retooled in a way that doesn't actually support what people need or want in a real material way.
Well, and I think and battleground is probably a poor choice of words, but I do find it relevant, not from a crime. We could talk about police and surveillance and crime. And, I think a lot of cities are getting maligned by, political leaders saying this place is, well, just like we were talking about my own neighborhood here in Barcelona. Don't live in Raval. It's dangerous. I'm talking more about housing access, rent versus ownership, the real where you either get included or you're a service worker. And I'm going to take this as from an American perspective who lived in a lot of small southern towns. Downtown, gentrification is an overused term, but a lot of those bartenders, a lot of those service workers are having to live 15, 20 miles out of town. Their vehicle cost is huge. They got to pay for downtown parking now. There's no free parking. There's gas, there's insurance. And my God, one of my first jobs was delivering Domino's pizza in an old Ford Thunderbird, and I swore I took more money to work to put gas in the tank than I did taking it home. So I've schlepped, and that was back in the '80s, but it's relevant because it's getting harder to get included in the city, whether it's about jobs, education, livability. And we talk in Citizen One a lot about livability. I think that's where, and where we've seen here in Spain and other parts of Europe and Italy as well, the over tourism economies and the backlash to that. So how do we make our reframing the question away from perhaps battleground, but how do we make our cities more representative of the least of us, not just the richest who can afford to buy their way in?
I think part of it has to do with public transportation. So you reference driving in when you were younger, driving around in your Ford Thunderbird in the 80s when cars were gas guzzlers. So yeah, it was using up a lot of gas.
4-barrel, man. That thing, it didn't even get 6 miles per gallon. It's a long time.
Yeah.
It was
But even just
lame.
trying to get people out of cars,
Yeah.
public transportation is an important method for doing that. And Europe and Asia doesn't do a great job at doing that. And actually Latin America, I will give Latin America its props as
Great.
well.
Yep.
Because we see those, what are those called? We call them cable cars in some places. They're called funiculars in other places. I never know which word to use. But we have like those tall poles and you have the cars which kind of steep.
Cable cars or, yeah.
Yeah, so Latin American cities are doing more of that to bring public transportation in a more affordable way to more people who have the least means. So they're doing a great job of that. But I don't think we can exclude the US either, because American cities are beginning to invest, American metros are beginning to invest more in trains. I follow Segregation by Design, which is both an app, not an app, it's an account on Instagram as well as a website. So segregationbydesign.com. And on Instagram, he follows other accounts which also talk about transportation and housing, other things. And so when I follow those, I do see that American cities across the country, both from the big cities like LA, New York, Chicago, Boston, to the smaller places like the Kansas cities and the Iowa cities and like those small towns, are also investing in public transportation. I mean, LA, which is the ultimate car-centered city, they keep expanding their light rail system. I think it's the largest. I don't know if it's the largest in the world, but it's definitely the largest in the country at this point. It used to be Boston's, and now it's Los Angeles's. So congrats to LA. But public transportation is one way in which we get more people to become more involved in the lifeblood of the city, because we're actually giving them a means in which they can come and go, a reliable, affordable, safe means by which they can come and go. And we're also making sure that not only can they be here, they can go back easily without hassle and in a way that respects their time. Because I think that's the other thing too. Like you can live 2 hours outside of the city, but if it takes 3 hours to get in because of traffic, you're not respecting people's time. You're just saying you got to deal with it. And I think we also, in the US at least, we need to come to a reckoning with highway expansion. So in a place like Texas, and probably in Florida and some places as well, they keep
Atlanta.
trying to, where did you say Atlanta?
Atlanta.
Yeah. They keep wanting to expand the highways. And what something that we just never, I don't think most people think about is these highways reach their maximum capacity only for about 3 hours a day, an hour and a half in the morning and an hour and a half in the evening. Why do we need to keep expanding the highways if they're only, if out of 24 hours of the day, there's only 3 of the hours that they're used at that level? Instead of, why don't we take the resources, take the funds that are used for those and use them to expand access to public transportation? And then also in terms of housing, because you mentioned housing as well, that one is a little more tricky because of the cost of building in the United States. It's just wildly expensive in some places because there's just a lack of land, but also due to some of the regulations, it just costs a lot to build. So if we can find ways, and I think some governors in particular, because would be a statewide issue, are finding ways in which people, developers can build more housing at an affordable price so that more people have access to that housing and more people can live in the cities. But as Americans, we also need to get more comfortable with density. We're not comfortable with density. We
No, no,
say,
no, no,
yeah,
no.
we should have these amazing cities, but we don't want to build an actual city. We want to build these large suburbs.
Sprawl is still very fashionable. I live in a 7 story on a pedestrian street next to the Boqueria, and I'm really, really happy with the walkability that I have. But you can't explain that to a lot of Americans. They just don't understand it. And when I was living back in Tennessee and in Georgia before I moved abroad to Saudi Arabia, I was spending 1,200 a month on mobility, car payment, insurance, wear and tear, gas. It's amazing how reallocating that money changes your life. And I don't know how to, because in America, there is such a car dependent built environment. It's not something you can transform overnight, but it is through zoning and through density. And I'm not just talking about the new urbanism that was kind of in vogue in the 90s and early 2000s, where it's like, oh, we're going to put a town center out in the suburbs with kind of Potemkin village ideas. That was just to provide the feel of a town where you still had the sprawl of the suburbs and all the great lawns and all you've also got the water conservation problems with lawns, especially in the Southeast where nobody does any xeriscaping. It's all turf and grass. So those are challenges that we really got to be addressing, and they are DEI issues. Would you not agree?
Definitely, definitely. As you were enumerating those examples, I was thinking part of the reason we have those lawns is because that goes back to this idea of, the English who first settled the United States, not first, but who settled the United States, and people
Last,
brought
right?
these, what's that?
They settled last, correct?
Yeah, they were definitely later. They were later in the game for sure. But they brought these ideas that having a manicured lawn was a sign of success. And then as we began to suburbanize, that idea was, laid across the expanse of the United States. And so we see some of the issues around um, space allocation, water use, waste removal, all of these things. And also, when some of these suburbs were built, they were built without sidewalks because making a place where people could walk might encourage people who don't have cars, who at the time were, well, who at the time were primarily people who were black and brown living in cities. They might be encouraged to amble through the neighborhoods or to walk from their neighborhoods into our neighborhoods. So there's just a lot of structural things that are cultural in a way, quite the right word. They're historic, they're cultural, but they're structural. And until we disentangle those with intention, and that's the thing, with intention, it can't just be like this would be nice. We actually have to make the intention to say, this stops here. These suburbs literally stop here. Now let's start filling them in with intention to create these denser communities. They don't all have to be cities, but they could be denser communities that are better used and that use space and resources in a smarter way.
Fully agree. And I think the important distinction here is you can have those conversations without guilt, without apologetics. But as you said earlier in this episode, understanding the history, how it was built this way and why. It doesn't mean anybody's talking about suburban reparations, for lack of a better term. And suburbia keeps sprawling. There are many towns that are fighting accessory dwelling units in a backyard environment. Even a mother-in-law's apartment is going to ruin the character of the neighborhood. Those people need to learn some history about their neighborhoods. And you can't just, I mean, it's not about tearing down perfectly good housing stock, but we also, with our aging boomers, and here I'm talking primarily about the United States, I have less context for it in Europe, Asia, or the global South, but boomers are hanging on to those big houses in the suburbs, which is a lot more space than they need. Whether that means more duplexes or fourplexes, will that change the character of a neighborhood? I hope so. I hope, you could bring in more young families and singles and people who might transform that community for the next couple of generations. And I don't know that we're thinking broadly enough about how we could reimagine suburbs entirely for both economic, political, and class, and just basic housing inclusion.
I also wonder, do we need to rethink the suburbs? Because I think there's still room to rethink the cities. I mean, especially these very large cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles that have more than enough spaces that are vacant, more than enough lots that are vacant that can support probably tens of thousands more people. I mean, Mayor Mamdani in New York is looking at trying to use some city-owned parcels that I guess are vacant or underutilized to house, I think, 20,000 or 50,000 more units or families. I forget what the metric was, but he was talking in the tens of thousands. Oh, and that's in New York, which is already quite dense. So I think in a city where like Chicago, where like I go to Chicago on a regular basis, and I'm like, there's a lot of space here. Even in just when you get outside the loop. So even when you're in South Loop or in like some of the neighborhoods just to the north, I'm like, there's a lot of empty space here.
I
I'm
mean,
coming
you
from
look
an
at
East Coast point of view.
Yeah. Are you talking about like Waukegan, kind of north of the city, or where are
No,
you
I'm
talking
talking
about?
about within the city boundaries
Okay.
itself.
Okay, got it, got it,
Within the
got it.
city. So not even going to the west side, when the west side has a lot of empty lots, or even the far south side. Just in
Right,
the, between Hyde Park and Edgewater along the lake. That space there, it's probably like a 10-mile space from north to south, and that's in between those two neighborhoods. There's still a lot of space. There's a lot of space. Or or something is built, it's like a one-story building or it's a one or two-story parking garage. And I'm like, Chicago has space. They're making choices. Someone's making a choice not to use that space differently. They're concentrating so much of the development in the Loop or in West Loop. Very little of it further outside of those neighborhoods. And I'm like, there's so much more they could be building here. But there's choices. They're making choices not to do that, not to utilize the transit that they have, and not to replace or reinstall the transit that was removed.
right. Well, and I think there's your first link is how does transit provide greater accessibility in those targeted areas that are ripe for infill redevelopment, whether the buildings and putting, like you said, putting the suburbs aside, but looking at urban infill. It's lots, yes, but I'm going to be really curious to see what the Mamdani administration also does with commercial building stock that could be transformed into residential, much greater density. Now, the buildings, there are financial challenges to that because they're not built for residential. There's a lot of codes issues related to that. But to your point, it's transit first, putting access to an area that can be redeveloped, and then looking at where we can maximize, I think, the number of housing units. But urban infill is more expensive than rural, than suburban. So I think we have to put all the cards on the table and make sure that mayors and governors are looking at housing policy at more of I hesitate to say it, but a quick win scenario. I remember I got so mad back in the day, and I've maybe mentioned this a couple of times to some people, but remember when under the uh, the George W. Bush administration, when the permanent supportive housing initiative started with Housing First, getting homeless housing going. And there was one project in particular that it took, I think, 4 or 5 years and $6 million to deliver 48 units of permanent supportive housing for the homeless. We're talking about tiny couple of 100 square foot apartments, kitchenette, studio type thing. And they patched it together with community development block grant money, historic tax credits, because it was a historic brownstone kind of 1920s building. And I had never seen such a botched project in my life. And this was back when I was a community activist, we were going through the commercial real estate listings going, here's an empty abandoned church. Here is a empty motel. Here is a 80 unit apartment building. If your goal is to get people housed, there is available stock right now. Oh, no, 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 no. We can't do that. It's not up to code. It's all these excuses because the HUD developers had to come in and get their slice. Instead of the stated goal was to get people off the street, was it not? We could, I mean, not to oversimplify it, but from an urban barn raising perspective, you could bring in teams of volunteers for a month or two and probably clean up that old motel and make it pretty decent. Maybe it's not the same approach, but this is where I feel like we've got to get a lot more radical.
Yes, and we also have to address the NIMBYism as well. Because I can imagine with that project that you just described or that initiative that you just described, there are probably people all over the country or all over that region who were like, I don't want these homeless people living next to me. Not thinking about the fact that they could have been veterans, they could have been seniors, they could have just been families with young children. People are thinking about, folks from like men from the 1970s. Okay, that's my stereotyping there, but they've been thinking about, a certain look from like a movie or something that was like, okay, this is just going to bring danger and blight to my community versus this is actually going to fill my community with new people, new eyes on the streets who, as we know, has been proven that when you have more eyes on the street, you have safer communities because there's less isolation. There's less of an opportunity for crime to happen. So by helping someone on one side of things, they help you indirectly in another side of things. So I think the NIMBYism is also a concern as well.
Well, and there's another dark side to NIMBYism, which is almost reverse NIMBYism. A lot of cities will choose one or two zip codes and put all of the low income projects there rather than equal distribution. Because of the NIMBYs and the other zips, we're like, we're not going to fight them. We're just going to dump it all over here where there are no jobs, where the transit is lousy, where the safety is terrible, and where there are, when you come home and all the billboards say gun crime means hard time, you're living in the wrong zip code, right? And I think cities need to be much more honest about that history as well. I've actually got an essay I've written about that I think you'll find particularly relevant.
Yeah, please send it to me. But yeah, I agree. So in Boston, we would see that in Boston. So my neighborhood, Roxbury, like I said, was predominantly Black, but also predominantly lower middle class or lower class economically. And so it became very clear when there was more transparency in the data, it became very clear that the majority of low income housing, like public low income housing, was the new ones were being built in Roxbury. And as other ones were being closed because they were reaching their ends or they had passed their lifespans, they were like, oh, we'll just build it here in this part of Roxbury. In part because Roxbury had the space, because again, through urban renewal and through the highway construction, through all those things that happened in the mid 20th century, Roxbury was dismantled. And so there were just pockets of open space left. And it said, oh yeah, let's just fill these in here as we clean up, quote unquote, clean up, as we demolish this over somewhere else. And so again, that added to what I said before, neighborhoods taking on not just a class dimension, but they became racialized as well. And then you just had, generally what we do in the US is we just warehouse poor people. We just warehouse them. We stack them up, them together, and we just warehouse them. We do that with people who committed crimes, and we do that with poor people. We do that, but we don't describe it that way. But that's exactly what we do. And I think the crazy thing, I know I'm going on a tangent now, is when the people who design jails also design our schools. And so I kind of wonder what kind of psychological impact that has on young people when they go to a place where they are channeled and funneled and controlled in a way, not just by the social functioning of the school, but by the actual design of the schools themselves. And I remember one time visiting a friend in New York when his kids were still young. They were, I think, 5 and 7 or 7 and 9. And he was driving around. He's like, "Oh, that's my kid's." He's like, "Oh, we're going to pass by my kid's school." And I said, "Oh, well, why is there a jail right here?" And he's like, "That's their school." And to me, I was like, I can't imagine going to school like that because there were bars on every window. The doors looked like they had double locks. It was up a flight of stairs. It was built in the 1920s, but it was reinforced in the 1960s and the 1980s. And I was like, wow, I just couldn't imagine going to school like that, where like you look out your window and you just see bars.
Sends a message, doesn't it?
It does. It does. I mean, the kids get used to it because a lot of the schools are that way, but I'm like, but they don't have to be that way. They really don't. When I look at a place, well, it's also how our American society has changed. It's become a lot more violent and a lot more dangerous and a lot more unpredictable. But then, as I said before, I lived in Japan for 5 years, and not that Japanese schools are beautiful because they're really not. But when you're in a city like Osaka or you're in a city like Hiroshima or Tokyo, the schools are there. The schools have grounds that the kids can run around in. The schools have they're designed architecture to have some openness and flow of air and light. And I'm like, why can't we design schools in cities and American cities that way? I'm sure the suburban schools where they raise hundreds of millions of dollars have that. There's no reason why our urban schools can't as well.
Well, Derek, I know we waxed a little dystopian here, but I think it's a very useful illustration of some concrete topics related to structural inclusion. But I guess from an urbanism and cities and DEI perspective, what are you hopeful about? What are you excited about?
Well, there's a couple of things that question gets me thinking about. So one is some of what we referenced earlier. So we do see that in terms of public transportation, cities both in the US, Latin America, Asia, and Europe are actually doing more to expand their public transportation. They're doing more to make sure there's some structural access for people to come from a broader geographic span and actually participate in the lifeblood of the core of the metropolitan area. So I think that's exciting. That's really cool, especially in the American context because we've been avoiding that for so long. I am curious to see how residential building evolves because over the past 10 years or so, you see these fantastic buildings, these fantastic renderings of buildings that have forests growing on them or that have plants growing out for them. And I'm like, when I first saw those 10 years ago, I thought, how is that going to work? I still don't understand the mechanics of buildings. I don't understand the architectural structure of buildings, but if they can build forests and gardens on buildings, I'm all for it. And I'm looking forward to seeing that happen. I think that's going to be really cool. Politically is where I am looking forward to seeing how we get past this present moment. Because I think this political moment in the United States and in a lot of other countries, mostly in Europe, but a little bit in Latin America, somewhat in Africa as well. And I don't know so much about Asia and Australia, but at least in the Atlantic world, politically, we're at a very challenging crossroads. And I'll use challenging as my choice here because I think a lot of white people are realizing the deal that their parents and grandparents made is a bad deal. It's a bad deal that's coming back to bite the community in general. And community can be taken as a little c, like, their white ethnic community in whatever metropolitan area, or community can be written with a large C as like the entire society. And it's coming back to bite them because these types of movements that we're experiencing, these type of extremist movements, it can be on the left or it can be on the right. They always come back to eat their own. And when they're done eating their own, they come for you. Or the other way around. They come for you first and then they eat their own. Sometimes in this case, it's happening all at the same time. And so I will be excited to see what comes out of this when we get past this moment. Because I think a lot of people are learning a lot of things. I think a lot of people who are saying, oh, it's done, we just need to wait it out, will find that that's ridiculous. because you can't wait this thing out. It's going to come for you at some point in one way, shape, or form. And so you need to resist it and you need to do something about it in order for you to get what you actually want in the long run.
Yeah.
So I'll
Well
pause
put.
there.
Yeah, no, I think that's great because you think about your parents and your grandparents and how I think a lot of white people didn't think that these economic challenges, the market would just continue to go up and everybody would be included. And from, not just affordability of housing, but and I know you do a lot in financial markets as well. I mean, even purchasing a home is getting increasingly unattainable for Black people, Latinos, everybody. The chairs keep getting removed, and we got to talk about that. And I think that reckoning, that structural reckoning, is what I'm excited about. Is rather than just lose hope and say, it's over. I don't think it is, but we've got to look at, like you said, new housing models. There's co-housing, there's community land trusts. There's a lot of things that we could be doing differently that we may not be choosing to yet, but we're going to have to look both at that infill and at those suburbs and say, how could this work better for more people? And there is nothing woke about that, in my opinion.
And I think also one last thing is that we should, as a society, get excited about the demographic changes that have been happening over time. I mean, I remember first reading about them when I was a kid in the 80s, and they were saying I don't know if it was 2050 or 2040 or 2060, but they said by this point, America will no longer be a majority white country or whatever it was. And I remember reading that and I was like, I grew up in a city, so I was like, oh, I didn't know that it already wasn't.
Right.
But the way in which the article was written and the way in which successive articles were written, it was almost a sense of like, we need to be worried about this. We need to be concerned about this because we don't know what we're going to do. And again, as someone who lived in the city and who's lived in cities most of his life, I was like, we already know what to do. We're already doing it now. So what's the problem here? So I think we need to like reframe or we need to shift our frame of thinking around what the demographic changes mean. If you actually look at metropolitan areas, and I'll take Houston. I don't particularly like Houston, but I think Houston is an interesting case study for how a metropolitan area can grow and absorb people from all corners of the world and give them opportunity. Like, there's this highway outside of Houston. I forget what it's called, but it basically functions like a Chinatown. So all these Asian restaurants are all on this highway. And of course, Houston has a lot of Latinos, has a lot of Black folks, white folks scattered in there, but they're sort of divided up. They're divided up by the highways. But Houston, if you look at it as a metropolitan area, it kind of works. It kind of works the way New York works. It kind of works the way, I would say, Boston kind of works. In the sense that everybody has an opportunity. Everybody can find a place. It may be more difficult for some than others, but there is still the opportunity, and more people are given access, and more people can have access to resources, to financing, to space, whatever it is. The demographics will work themselves out, and people will be able to all succeed together. And I think we need to be excited about that because it does work.
Yeah, I think that just sums it up nicely. Derek Lumpkins, executive coach, DEI consultant, Refresh Strategies, coffee drinking buddy, and I look forward to having more conversations like this. I think it's been great to have you here today.
Thank you for having me here. It's been great. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel, host of Citizen One, Exploring Our Urban Future, and this has been a really interesting episode. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you.